Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for coming to this evening's lecture, which will be on the correction of optical defects. And we're going to look at this from the history of spectacles to the advent of laser. Next year, we'll be talking about lasers in some detail, so I'm not going to talk too much about lasers tonight, but just up until the advent. Now, there's a number of sources of the information. In particular, I'm grateful to Neil Handley from the College of Optometrists, who's the world expert in this field. The American Academy of Ophthalmology have a great resource, and they've been helpful with pointing me in the right direction and giving me some images, and the College of Ophthalmologists and a number of other books. At the College of Optometrists in Craven Street is this antique print. He says, "Ladies and gentlemen, I have the honour for the first time in this county of Kent to deliver a lecture on optics." And the yokel stands up in the background and says, "In this part of the world we don't call them optics, we call them hot poles." And the interesting thing is he's wearing the latest design of spectacles himself. And this is the first time that spectacles actually, we could really call them spectacles, where they have side arms, side pieces. Now, this talk, we'll talk about what the optical defects of the eye are, we're talking about the correction with lenses, and then we'll talk about that 4,000 to 5,000 year history of lenses, up to the invention of eyeglasses, a little chat on contact lenses, and some gory pictures that those of you of a nervous disposition can leave early, and then a little laser taster. So, we're talking about the focused image. The human eye has evolved to focus rays of light onto the retina so we can use this sharply formed image for perception and enable us to go about our daily business in the world and predict what is out there. Some eyes are a little bit short for the system and the rays focus behind. In youth, and if it's not too excessive, we can use this muscle here to make the lens stronger and get a focused image. If the system is still too short, then this doesn't work and you still end up with a blurring. And furthermore, to use this system, it's linked with what's called convergence of the eyes moving together. And hypermetropia, or long-sightedness, is a major cause of convergent squints in children. And then finally, we have short-sightedness, or myopia, which is where the focus is in front of the retina rather than behind. These are the major optical defects. We'll discuss some of the variants of these as they come up in the lecture. So this is normal sight. We can focus for distance. We can read the optometry eye chart at the other side of the room through a mirror, so it's twice the length of the room. And that approximates to infinity. It's not exactly infinity, but it approximates. And if we accommodate, as we can do when we're young, but we can't when we're old, we can focus for near as well. It's really a rather marvellous system. Now, when you're long-sighted, you can't focus for distance, and focusing for near is even worse, so we have to correct this. One of the ways we correct it is to add more power to the system with a plus lens in front of it. This could be, for example, a reading lens for near, and some people need long-sighted plus lenses for distance as well. We could use a contact lens. Sometimes we have to take the lens out and replace it with an intraocular lens, which is most commonly done in the context of cataract surgery, but occasional brave souls actually undergo this operation to correct their extreme long-sightedness for particular reasons. Or we could use laser, and we could reshape the cornea to make it steeper, giving it greater power. And this once again stops the blurring, sharpens the image, and allows us to get a decent focus. The opposite of this, myopia or short-sightedness, we mentioned, gives us a problem with distance vision. However, for near, we can focus, and at whichever distance, depending on how short-sighted you are, you can focus on a reading or a near object. Here, we need to use a minus lens to decrease the power of the system. We can do that with a spectacle lens, we can do it with a contact lens, we can carve the laser carve the cornea of the laser and make it flatter, or we can put an intraocular lens in, which is a very brave thing to do for myopia unless you have a cataract, because in youth it's associated with a very high incidence of retinal detachment and other visual problems. Presbyopia, which is the long-sightedness of old age, when the crystalline lens in the eye becomes too tough to change the shape, was the main stimulus for developing reading aids in antiquity. Dante talks, many when they wish to read hold the writing at a distance from their eyes, so the image may enter there more easily and more sharply. Unfortunately, as we get even older and older, our arms don't become long enough to do this. And with small print, it gets smaller and smaller the further away it is. So we need an extra plus lens to focus, to read. And here we are seeing such a person, Joris van der Pela, in a very famous painting where he's holding proudly his reading glasses, where he's just intimating he's been reading his Bible just before he meets the Madonna. So we've been talking about lenses and what exactly lenses do. Here's a ray diagram of some lasers going through two lenses. One of them is converging the light, which would eventually converge to a point over here. And this second lens is diverging those convergent lenses. So this is a minus lens, and this is a plus lens. And this is actually a demonstration of Galileo's telescope. The problem with lenses is that they cause aberrations. We should get a fairly sharp point of focus, but unfortunately we don't. We get what's called spherical aberration, where we get a blur because rays at different parts focus differently. So we end up having a blur circle rather than a perfect circle. And we also get chromatic aberrations, where rays of different colours are focused at different points as well. So spectacle lenses of different types had an awful lot of problems to overcome in their youth, and even today lenses create problems, such as with the Hubble telescope. Now, ancient lenses have a very controversial history. There are certainly many substances which are crystal clear, such as crystal, quartz, and beautiful objects were made out of this, such as this flask which came from the treasury at Saint Denis, and is actually not made of glass, it's made of rock crystal. Various other substances have transparent properties, and if they are carved in a certain way, they will cause magnification. And we find objects like this throughout the record of antiquity, and we'll talk about some of them because some of them are most interesting indeed. Remember, it's not just quartz, rock crystal, but other transparent things such as beryl, which is very common and comes in different varieties, where we call it aquamarine or emerald. So even water itself can focus light, and Seneca noticed this. He said, there are mirrors which increase objects they reflect. Letters, however small and dim, are comparatively large and distinct when you see them through a glass globe filled with water. And it's acting as a convergent lens, enabling him to read this quotation. And these actually have a long history. Lace makers used them as late as the 1850s, filled with water, with candlelight next to them to do the very, very fine sewing when the lights went out at 4 o'clock in the evening, as they did tonight. Now, ancient ideas of optics go back a long, long time. Euclid, of course, we've discussed previously, and Ptolemy described possibly one of the most important books before Newton. It turns out that using these ancient Greek sources, many of the Arab writers in the Arab Renaissance just before 1000 AD were able to work out many principles that took us in Europe several hundred years to rediscover them. Ibn Sal, for example, describes very clearly the law of refraction. And what he actually shows in this diagram is that the length of this hypotenuse, which is a continuation of the ray that is bent, compared to the length of this, is the inverse proportion of how that material refracts, the refractive index. And different materials have different refractive indexes. They have different powers of bending light. Mirrors also have a very long history. We have ancient carvings from the Far East. We have pictures in ancient Greek vases. We also have the wonderful story of Archimedes, who invented the burning mirror for destroying the Roman ships at a distance before they were able to come into Syracuse. Unfortunately, it wasn't too successful, and as we know, they came to Syracuse and put him to the sword. There's an interesting quotation from a play, The Clouds, which was staged in Athens in 423 BC. And Strepsiades, who has a little bit of a problem with the lawyers, says, have you ever seen a beautiful transparent stone at the druggist with which you may kindle a fire? And Socrates says, you mean the crystal lens? He said, that's right. Well, now, if I placed myself with this stone in the sun a long way off from the clerk, while he was writing out the conviction, which of course was on a wax tablet, he could then melt the conviction, and therefore there would be no case against him. So clearly the principles of convergence and using convergence of light were well known in antiquity. But we haven't yet invented the reading glasses or the reading stone. Now, it becomes a problem about 1000 AD when books start to become a little bit more common, and where books are becoming common are in monasteries. And there's a really big important drive in monasteries to develop some aid for reading to extend the natural working life of the scholars. There are a number of earlier stories that don't really hold up water. You'll see this one in many of the textbooks, Nero's Emerald. And Pliny the Elder, as we know, who was due to die in Herculaneum when the volcano blew up, describes lenses for cauterizing wounds. He also describes emeralds are concave in shape, so they concentrate vision. When they lay flat, they reflect objects like mirrors. And emeralds were used to refresh tired eyes. This is on his section in the book where he's discussing various stones. Now, Nero princeps gladiatorum pugnat spectatis magra. What he's saying here is Nero is watching the gladiatorial contest with an emerald or a mirror. It's also been suggested that Nero might have used glasses. Perhaps Nero was myopic, and there's another text which says that, from Pliny, which means either that he could only see near objects or that his vision for near was defective. And he certainly had remarkable eyes. Oculis caesius et. So they were grey eyes. Now that could mean two things. Either he had defective vision or he had remarkable blue-grey eyes. We don't really know. However, we do know that he was a successful sportsman, and either they were scared to lose against him, or they let him win, or he was just a very brilliant charioteer. But he did win several races, so we know his eyesight must have been good enough to be charging around the arena at great speed. Also, emeralds had other uses. They were used as a gem, as the sporting colour, the green colour for the green racing team, which actually happens to be the emeralds racing team, or even as a charm, a magic charm. The whole story may have actually been based on a complete misreading from an earlier text that was written in Greek, which actually mistakes the use that Nero spied on the games through a tent with a hole in, and then that was translated that he looked at the games using a mirror, and you can see actually that the translation is dependent on just one or two changes in the Greek word. Now, why would he be in a tent? That's because he didn't go to the games. He was away doing other things, but the Roman populace expected him to be there. So they set up a tent, and that was where Nero was or wasn't. There is stronger evidence for the use of lenses, particularly with carving. And a marvellous study was done on gems and how they were carved, looking at these markings on the edges and the very, very fine lines. And it turns out that a modern machinist can get a precision of about 0.2 millimetres with the naked eye. A simple magnifying glass is 0.08 millimetres, and the median spacing, that's the average spacing on these gems, is half of that. So it seems implausible that these people were able to do this without using some magnification. And in fact, it turns out that magnifying glasses have been found in artists' and engravers' houses, particularly one in Pompeii, which was discovered 150 years ago. Now, there are other arguments that perhaps these people were just very short-sighted, and that enabled them to work very closely. So we don't have definitive evidence that they did use lenses, but it would seem implausible that they didn't use something like a reading stone or some sort of magnification to do this. Now, the earliest lenses that appear in the record appear 4,500 years ago in ancient Egypt, in the old dynasty. Now, Khufu, of course, builds the Great Pyramid at Giza. His father built this step pyramid. And at the same period as these pyramids were built, they found, just adjacent to here in the Serapeum, a number of very interesting things, including the Avenue of the Bulls, but they also found some statues that have these beautiful, remarkable eyes in them. And these took an awful lot of skill to make. They're actually polished lenses, and they have two focuses, one on the front surface, and then they have another surface carved into the back. The whole thing is then set into copper, and it gives an astonishingly realistic appearance. And these eyes follow you about, and if ever you're next in the Louvre, do go and search out the Scribe Cupri, the sitting scribe, which was given to France as part of the excavation spoils in the 1800s. These are embedded rock crystal eyes. The lenses are actually embedded itself into white magnesite, which has little red veins in it, giving it a very, very realistic look. And as you move around the statue, the eyes appear to follow you. There's a three-dimensional depth to them, a wonderful optical illusion, which I think you can see here. So this freshly painted must have been rather a scary thing. And it wasn't a one-off. There are other statues that exist. In fact, there's two paired statues. This is interesting because the actual ancient Egyptians and also the ancient Greeks, females were always painted white and men were always painted brown. So you can always tell if you don't know the sex of a statue from the colour what it was likely to be. There's examples, of course, from 4th dynasty in Egypt itself, in Cairo, the statue of Kai, and back in the Louvre again of a similar period, a little bit later, 700 years later. This went out of fashion, this technique, and then 700 years later, invented again very, very shortly, and it appears in a couple of statues. This statue we've met before because it's the earliest depiction I know of that shows a cataract, and it's the statue of Kai Paris in sycamore wood, and is in the Cairo Museum. And when the workers actually first excavated this, they thought he looked just like the headman. So he actually was called Sheikh el-Beled for a long time, as the headman of the village, as a joke, which of course the people in charge of the excavations didn't get. Now, this died out completely, and eyes later on were made much less realistically, not using carved lenses, but made out of ceramics, using fascians, which was an ancient Egyptian ceramic that was made of crushed quartz and sand, not of clay, and has a beautiful effect. And then the whole thing was set with obsidian, which is the glass from, naturally occurring glass from volcanic activity. And a number of versions exist, such as these amulets, and there's one of these in the Optical Museum in Craven Street. There are several examples in the British Museum and other museums in the Egyptian collections. They're very, very common. They were buried with most mummies, and the reason they were buried with most mummies is because of the story of the rejuvenation. In a battle with Seth, Horus had lost his left eye, and the wound was healed by Hathor, the goddess. So the left eye of Horus represents the moon, waxing and waning. He's losing and regaining his sight. And this rejuvenation property is why these wedjats, or Eye of Horus, are very common. And even today, they're still sold to people as charms and magic amulets. This is Troy. Troy was originally excavated by John Brunton and Frank Calvert, whose family owned the land, but they didn't really have very, very much money. But they did identify the site, which was the first time this had been done. Heinrich Schliemann, of course, identified the site because he'd read Homer and he knew where it was. So he arrived on this already excavated site with tons of money, which he'd made by cornering the gold market in Sacramento and various other business ventures, and went right the way through and found this fabulous treasure, which he put on his wife and photographed her and said this was the treasure of Priam and this was Helen's. Unfortunately, he'd missed the point completely. He'd dug right through Troy. He was now hundreds of years earlier in a different layer, and all the evidence from Troy in his trenches was completely destroyed. Whilst he was digging, some interesting objects that look like this came up, which are magnifying lenses. They disappear completely from the historical record. Schliemann himself doesn't even account for them in his documents. He totally ignored these most interesting findings. And then everything disappeared in 1944. And the Russians said, well, war, it happens, probably got blown up and so on. But then eventually it did turn up. And then they allowed the American historians to go and visit it. And the treasures are labelled Treasure A, and there's another treasure, Treasure L, which include lapis lazuli axes and some beautiful things, and the lenses, which we thought we'd lost. And some studies have been done on these, and they are definitely magnifying lenses. They're about 9 millimeters in diameter, and they are just exactly the correct size and shape to be used as a reading aid. Whether they were used as a reading aid or not, we don't know. The Nimrod lens had been discovered much earlier by Layard in the ruins of King Sargon's palace. Now, this lens definitely has excellent optical properties and was presented by David Brewster at the British Association for the Advancement of Science as a magnification lens. And it was thought possible that King Sargon himself might have used this for reading the very tiny script. It is obvious from the shape and cutting of the lens it could not have been intended as an ornament. We're entitled, therefore, to consider it to be intended to use as a lens, either for magnifying or concentrating the rays of the sun. And in fact, this story goes even further, where Giovanni Pitano actually thought it might represent a telescope, and therefore this explained why the Assyrians knew that Saturn had rings round it. The Syrians didn't know that Saturn had rings around it. They put sort of scorpions and snakes around lots of things, and their image of Saturn, which is a particularly important planet to them, had the snakes around them. There's no evidence that they actually discovered the rings. It's actually very difficult to believe that Galileo could even see the rings, and I've looked through his telescope and the picture I showed you before, and it's very difficult to see. He must have had extraordinary observation powers to see what he saw. So we definitely have lenses, and we definitely have lenses that we could use if we wanted to, but we don't know they use them. We also have them later on in the Bronze Age in Crete, in this little cave here, which was where, it's a really important cave where, in sort of mythology really, and it's where Rhea hid her son Zeus to stop him being killed by his father Kronos. It was discovered in 1884, and just outside it here is an altar to Zeus, which they found tons of stuff, and in the tons of stuff they found, quite recently, some plano-convex lenses, which look rather similar to the lenses I've shown you before, and again they have the magnification power that would be compatible with them having been used as engraving tools. Rather cruder and not as good as the Egyptian lenses that were made into eyes are in these libation vessels from Minoas Palace. What happens here is the libation drink is inside, you tilt it and it pours out, used for special ceremonies. But they also carved crystals here which also have magnifying power, so clearly they had the ability to polish. Whether they used them or not, we have no evidence at all. More intriguing in Tanis, which is the New Kingdom, this is the sort of around about the time of the Greeks and the Romans, in northern Egypt, two more lenses were discovered by Sir Flinders Petrie. Sir Flinders Petrie was an amateur archaeologist. He taught himself, self-taught Egyptologist, very brainy, set up the Institute of Egyptology in University of London, where some of his collection still exists. Both of these lenses were plano-convex, both of them again would have worked, but one of them was allegedly discovered in the house of an artist, and the destruction of that house was dated to AD 174. So we're now finding lenses in context with where they should be. Sir Flinders Petrie dies in Jerusalem in 1942 and donates his head to science. His lenses in the British Museum. Now the Mayans also have lenses, and you can see quite clearly they're acting as magnifying glasses on the bottom. Furthermore, images are being made by these lenses. So these are focusing lenses. These are made out of crystal quartz. The eyes are fierce looking, but they're not quite of the quality, one might say, of the ancient Egyptians. About 800 AD, Charlemagne had this talisman made for his wife for undying love. Must have worked, because they stayed married until death, and he eventually was buried with it. It has a fragment of the true cross in it, and you can see the emerald on this surface is acting as a magnification lens to magnify this tiny fragment. The back surface doesn't have magnifying powers and hasn't been carved in that way. So once again, magnification is being used functionally. Now Roger Bacon, of course, is associated with the idea that if we use a magnification in front of print, we could see he didn't invent spectacles, he didn't invent glasses, but very clearly in his writings he's familiar with magnification and its use in an appropriate setting. However, before this, very sophisticated lenses have been found in Viking deposits. Now, where they come from, we don't know. The Vikings had extensive trading routes right the way down the Volga, right the way through to Byzantium. Both Vikings and Anglo-Saxons fought together in the Varangian Guard, which was the personal guard of Byzantine emperors. So they had many connections, and it would seem that these lenses are so beautifully and so perfectly made that even with computer enhancement, we cannot improve their optical qualities. They're what are called aspheric lenses, and they're used in the highest quality projectors. And they get rid of those aberrations I was talking about before. How they made them, who made them, whether it was just one craftsman who made them, because they all date from a similar period, will never be known. But so far they've only been found around the Baltic in one or two special sources. So can we date the invention of spectacles? We've got all this optical aids, and it's tantalizing really, isn't it? Well, we could possibly say the first spectacles were made between 1268 and 1289. And that is based on the sermon given by Friar Giordano da Pisa, who's a very popular teacher. And he was giving a Lent sermon in this hospital, in this church, when it was still a Gothic church without the facade. It is not 20 years since there was found the art of making spectacles. and he uses the words trovolate di fare gli occhiali. Now, occhiali is an important word, and we'll come back to that. One of the most useful arts on earth, and for those of us above a certain age, I would entirely agree with that. It's probably the most significant invention ever invented. I myself have seen and conversed with the man who made them first. He's writing in the vernacular. This is obviously aimed at the general public, and it was a very important invention for the scholarly Dominicans, particularly teachers such as Friar Giordano himself, who was a famous teacher in Bologna and Paris, and in fact he died on his way back to Paris in 1311 at Piacenza. He originally came from this monastery. In this monastery they found an ancient chronicle, which in 1313 records one of his contemporaries, Della Spina, in the Dominican monastery. Vir modestus et bonus ocularia ab alio prima facta. What he's saying here is that he was a modest and wonderful man. Spectacles having first been made by someone else who was unwilling to share them, he made them and shared them with everybody. By his ingenuity, he made him a room in the house of the eternal king. So Pisa could well have been, there is a good argument made by Ilardi that Pisa is the place where spectacles were first made by an unknown person we don't know, who didn't want to share it, but unfortunately for him, the secret got out by the monks, and the monks then transmitted this invention throughout the known world. Now, Pisa is plausible. It's possible that it was the place where glasses were invented. We have some other candidates which will come up later. It did have a small glass industry, it made drinking glasses, and it made a couple of other things. And in the Commune, they mention in 1321 the arte dei bicchieri, that's people making glass beakers, glasses to drink out of. And also mirrors were made, the arte della specchiari. So it's possible they had the right industry, and we have the documentation there. So it's a good date, about 1280. But in come the Venetians, and it turns out about the same time that this sermon was being given, the Venetians were already well organized and making things called rodi. And rodi are these little tops that you see on bottles. And it doesn't take much to realize if you take out the middle of that, you've actually got a reading lens. And in fact, they were quoted as being rodi da ogli, spectacle lenses. And they were distinguished from lapidis ad legendum, which were stones for reading, i.e. magnifying glasses. So clearly there was an industry here that was making lenses for looking out of. But we don't really have a real date for this. It's about 1300, which would put it about 20 years later than the alleged date for the Pisan invention. Then they liberalized glass making, spectacle making. The only thing was you had to make sure you stipulated it was glass, not the more expensive crystal. And anyone could make and sell them. Almost. You had to go through the Mercer's Company, who actually controlled all mercery. And this is the Tedeschi, the German trading centre in Venice, where this is now a post office, or was closing down as a post office, where all the trade went on from Germany, both import and export. And of course they taxed it, 5% tax. Remember Faraday, when he discovered electricity and was visited by the Prime Minister, he said, "What use is this?" He said, "I don't know what use it is, but no doubt your government will one day work out how to tax it." And they did the same with spectacle lenses, of course, straight afterwards. Anything that seems to be useful to the general populace will be taxed, almost certainly. So Mercer's controlled the trade there. The Florentine, not to be outdone, remember that they have these arguments between these cities, actually said, no, we had to invent, because we, of course, were the centre of civilization. So Francesco Redi perpetrates this fraud, and he says that there's this manuscript he read, the Treaty Congiute di Famiglie, that in 1299 Sandro di Pipozzo mentioned spectacles. Unfortunately, no one else has ever seen this. There's no evidence it ever existed, and the whole thing seems to have been a fraud. A larger fraud was then put out where they said they knew the name of the inventor of spectacles. He was Salvino degli Amati, and furthermore they knew where he lived and his family. They said, unfortunately, we can't tell you where his burial is, because in this church, when it was all cleaned out, we chucked out all the burials a couple of hundred years ago. But we do have a record. And later on, they forged, using an ancient head of Herodotus, and they put it onto an old body, and then they put this fake thing up that basically says, here is Salvino Diamati, who's the guy who invented spectacles. And they even had a little plaque on the street where he was invented. Anyway, this was all exposed as a hoax in the 1920s, and it was all a bit embarrassing, and the plaque disappeared, and the head was taken back off again, and everything quietened down a bit. But the fraud is perpetuated even to this day. Umberto Eco, in his book, The Name of the Rose, you might remember the film if you haven't read the book, as I haven't actually read it. But in it, the Franciscan friar William of Baskerville had received a pair of spectacles as a gift from the great master Salvino degli Amati. So when you perpetuate a fraud and you perpetuate it well, it can last for several hundred years. Why? Because you want Florence to be the centre of the universe, rather. So, early glasses may not have been all they were cracked up to be. And in fact, before they invented glasses, early writers suggesting you should use drops. And you want to use drops that would be styptic drops that would contract muscles. Not a bad idea, because actually you want to contract your ciliary muscle if you want to see for near. And there are various documents that do this, including some of the professors of medicine and early ophthalmologists in Montpellier. And we mentioned them before in the context of cataract surgery, where again they would rather give you drops than do cataract surgery. It was safer than ending up being tied in a sack and chucked in the Rhone, which was the problem if you got it wrong, as we know from previous lectures. Now, he's saying, don't use glasses, use the drops first. And only if the drops fail, use the glasses. And this is a repeated story that comes through. What it's actually telling us here is two things. One is people might have been scared that glasses could have been damaging the eyesight, and this story is still current today, because you start off at plus 0.5s, and 2 months later you need the plus 7.5s, and 6 months it's the 1s, then the 150s, and I'm seeing nods of recognition with the greybeards in the audience here, saying this is how, and then suddenly before you know it, you're on plus 3.5s, and you think you've damaged your eyesight, and you wish you'd never started in the first place. Of course, this is not true. All we're doing is following the natural curve of aging. If glasses were made, and they were used by the Dominicans, where is the evidence for them? Well, there is some evidence, and it's quite early. It's this beautiful church in Treviso of San Nicolo. Now, this Dominican church was a Gothic church, and the head of the Dominicans there wanted the chapter to move. So he built this beautiful chapter house and had it painted. Well, he actually redecorated the inside of it with this series of frescoes of famous Dominicans, of which many of them still exist. But unfortunately, we missed Dominic, Peter the Martyr, and Thomas Aquinas, which were blown up in the Second World War, unfortunately. But we are left with 37 monks. And in the church, there are some pillar frescoes, and this one, the fourth pillar down, they're actually piers, they're circular piers. Technically, they're not pillars, but anyway, this pillar here has a very interesting fresco as well, which we'll come back to. And here we have the first depiction of reading aids. Nicholas de Froville, with his little reading, looking at clear as a bell. So we know the date these paintings were done, and we know that someone who was old and ancient and as knowledgeable as he would be using a reading aid. So clearly it was a common thing, at least for monks and cardinals, to be doing. Nicholas de Froville himself was an interesting chap and was the confessor of King Philip IV of France, and he's frescoed on the southern wall. Also interesting writing implements around, so clearly a scholar. Pietro Esnardo di Ciampo, he is from Vicenza, also has a reading aid, and it's this. And this is a concave lens, which is a magnifying lens. In the Romance of the Rose, which is a contemporary writing, they say other mirrors make different objects appear in different situations, straight, oblong, upside down, in different arrangements. They make phantoms appear to those who look within. They even make them appear quite alive outside the mirror, either in water or on air. So concave mirrors were being used for projecting images, and also they can be used for magnification. Meissner, the German poet, said that small writing could be made legible for the aged by the use of a mirror, a spiegel. So clear evidence they were being used. And this is the fresco I showed you on the fourth pier down from the left in some magnification. And here is the magnifying glass of a different type that's in a leather pouch. They were also used by artists at this period. Now, there's a problem with using mirrors, is that it inverts. So if you hold it upside down, you could actually learn to read upside down and back to front. But there is a little trick you can do, and that is to hold the shaving mirror away from you, put the book upside down in front of the shaving mirror, and then you can read quite clearly in the mirror. It's remarkable, and this is the optical diagram of how that works. But in practical, we don't see reading mirrors with other mirrors in any of the images, so that's probably not what they did. What they probably did was this, which was to hold the mirror very closely at an angle and scan along, giving a magnified image of the page, erect, virtual magnified image. Spectacles. Here we go. Now we're on to the main button. Friar Ugoni, Cardinal Hugh, is clearly wearing spectacles on the end of his nose. This is the first depiction of spectacles that we know of. They're of this type, which are called Type 1 rivet spectacles. They're very light, they're only 2 millimeters thick, they're made of boxwood, very tough wood, with grooved rims with a little slit so that the lens could be inserted. Essentially, they're two magnifying glasses bolted together. Pretty simple. There may be an earlier image in a manuscript in Ghent, but it's uncertain, it's a marginal image, so you don't know when marginal images are added, so we can't clearly date that. Now, the earliest depiction of glasses in Florence is in this fresco that was originally in this church, which is the All Saints Church, the Chiesa di Ognissanti, which is the Franciscan church. But it was founded by a really scary fanatical lay order, the Umiliati. They were verging on the heretical, and they were probably descended from a bunch of Lombard noblemen who'd been captured in battle and taken off to Germany, where they came into contact with slightly more more scary versions of religion, and came back to Italy. Now, nobody really knew what to do with them, because they're kind of Catholics, but there have been a little bit of influence from Northern Europe on them. So eventually they were disbanded and taken over by the Franciscans. But in the church, which was redone, and had a big redo in the Baroque style, they still left Sandro Botticelli. Beautiful fresco here. He's actually buried in the church. And this one is the one we're interested in, because if we look on St. Jerome's desk, you will see this pair of glasses here. Can you see them? It's very tiny. They're this there. Now, what's interesting, an exact identical pair have been found in Florence. The only pair of spectacles of this period found to date. The only pair of ancient spectacles found in Italy. They're called a Type 2 rivet spectacle, and you'll notice now instead of being straight, there's a slight curve on them, which reduces the strain on the bolt in the middle. It's quite common, by the way, for St. Jerome to be pictured with spectacles, because he was a wise man, of course. He translated the Bible, and so therefore would need specs to do a job like that. And he became the patron saint of scholars and also of French spectacle makers. They only found those specs, by the way, in 1982. It's remarkable, this country that's made hundreds, thousands of pairs of spectacles, not a single example exists in their record, which either says an awful lot about Italian archaeologists or an awful lot about their export business, and that local Italians didn't need them, which seems very strange when we've got lots of pictures of local Italians using them. Here's the first image north of the Alps, and this is the spectacled apostle, the Brillen apostle. Sorry, Elizabeth, I'm going to mangle German in this talk. I mangled French in the last one, now's the time for German. Brillen is a very interesting word because it comes from the gemstone that we were talking about earlier that is used to make spectacle lenses. It's the oldest depiction of eyeglasses, as I said before, and it's tiny. It's down here. It's this fella here, so I magnified it for you. And you'll notice they're different. This is a Type 3 rivet spectacle. They've got flatter shafts. It's made out of a different wood. This is made out of lime wood, which was very commonly used in Northern Europe. It's beautiful, easy to carve, doesn't have much of a grain, flexible, and very, very light. And this technology of making this, of gluing the things together, had only really just been invented in the cabinet trade. And then again in Germany, in Weinhaus, we find this wonderful collection of a series of spectacles, many ancient ones. The monastery had been founded in 1221, and it went under a revolution, came under a much stricter regime. And later on in history, these floorboards were dug up, and underneath them they found lots of little things: pilgrim badges, knives, brushes, spindles, all sorts of things nuns shouldn't have been doing. They should have been listening to the word of God, and lots of spectacles, which means that they shouldn't have been sewing using their spectacles. They should have been listening to what was going on. And so, of course, they had to hide them all. And there are many examples, some complete spectacles, there's fragments of 9 others. These frames are of Mediterranean, they're the harder wood, the boxwood, and they're of the very early type that we showed you earlier. They also discovered some leather belt pouches. Plus magnification, plus 3 to 3.5, ideal. Many other examples exist in Europe. There's about 27 sites so far that have been discovered where we found these, well, archaeologists found these rivet spectacles. This is the one that are found in Lüneburg. And there's two finds in Lüneburg that are interesting. These were found in the Mikkelkloster, which is this beautiful church here. But there's also 4 spectacle lenses here, which have been used as part of this jewelled cabinet, little casket, which date from 1330. So very, very early. They're not used in the context of being spectacles, but clearly old spectacles have been recycled, or their lenses have been used to make these images. This is what the spectacles would look like if they were made and reconstructed. This one, of course, would have a lens in, but we don't know whether the lens would have been opaque or clear on that side, and we'll discuss that later on. So, the oldest spectacles of a known date are not very far from here, probably about 20 metres from here, because they're in this museum. And this is my drawing of them. They're the Trygglein spectacles. They're the oldest dated ones because we know the strata it came from. The walls of the embankment of the River Thames were constantly in need of repair. And this all ended in 1440 with a stone wall, when they didn't need the carpenters to shore it up anymore. And these were found on the other side of that stone wall, so they're pre-1440. And they're of a very early type. They're of the straight, type 1. They have some little holes carved in them here, which when they were tested, when a facsimile was tested on, the person actually found those pinholes to be functional, because pinholes sharpen the vision for distance. But it's probably not their primary function. They were possibly used just to lighten the frame. They're made of bone. Now, there are many other examples of these which are found all over the record. We've got some from the Swan Steps that may have been made of bone or antler, Merton Priory in Sutton, a particularly ornate pair where this part is beautifully carved with a lovely fretwork, Sion Abbey, these fragments here, the Battle Abbey, Chester Friary, Hales Abbey, Wickham Church, Northampton, Melrose Abbey. These are just examples of the widespread use of glasses of this period, which is remarkable. But you can also see, if you're in Italy and you're digging up a lovely gold chalice and you find a bit of bone like that, bit of rib, throw it away. And that's the problem, that in archaeological sites you have to really keep everything, because you don't know what they are until we can put them into context. And now, of course, anyone digging up something like this, like the Time team did at Wickham Church, they know exactly what it is, and it's a very significant finding. At this period, we also have customs records which show that glasses were imported in phenomenal amounts, 8 gross, 1,152 pairs between July and September alone in 1384. Nearly 1,000 in May to June, and in April to May, 4,104. This was a major import business, usually coming in on Dutch-named ships and usually being merchanted by Dutch-named merchants, people, although there are some exceptions. William Canston, for example, he has 4 dozenes, 4 dozen spectacles worth 2 shillings and 2pence. Very cheap. These are for the ordinary people. They're no longer just for the very rich church. And Chaucer, of course, the quote in 1390, the crone in the wife of Bath's Tale. Poverty a spectacle is, as thinketh me, through which he may his very friends see. So I think poverty is a pair of spectacles through which we see our true friends. Our friend in need is a friend indeed. So that's how you find out who your true friends are. And she's using this illusion of spectacles. We actually have old images of our own in England of spectacles. And this is at least from 1430, but could equally be 100 years earlier. It's very difficult to date this corbel. And there is the church, still in existence today, and that's the painting by Turner. Now we start making spectacles at this period, as well as importing them. And we have the first record of the person who made them, Paul van Bussen of Southwark. He was out to about 1458, and the first English one was a guy called Spike Dowd in 1485. Now, a very interesting story happens in Italy with the Sforza spectacles, and an order is sent out by Francesco Sforza to Florence for a large order, many dozens of spectacles. Sforza, after a rather colourful early life, rules wisely and well, managing to father somewhere between 22 and 120 illegitimate children on the way. His legitimate son, unfortunately, proved to be less successful than his illegitimate ones in personality, and became Duke of the Milan in 1466. He was famous for being cruel and tyrannical, and was actually stabbed to death on Boxing Day in the church of Santo Stefano Maggiore, where, interestingly, Caravaggio was to be christened. It has an unlucky history, this church, doesn't it? Anyway, the culprits were hunted down and executed, and there's a famous statement from one of them, Mora curva fama pe. What he's saying is, death is bitter, but glory is eternal. The memory of my deed will endure. And that was his final words as he was tortured to death. Now, we earnestly desire to have the eyeglasses, and he orders them for different ages, which how eyeglasses were ordered until the 1700s in England. He said, I'm 40 years old, can you send me a 40-year-old spec? Could you send me a 55-year-old? And they made the different strengths. But there's this sentence at the bottom, which has been interpreted by some, particularly Ilardi historians, saying 10 pairs for distant vision for the young. And what we're implying here is that these are no longer the plus lenses, that these are minus lenses for myopia, which tends to be more prevalent in the young. It's not strong evidence, but it's a possibility that at that time myopic lenses were being made. We have no record of them in any painting, in any archaeological record. That's the only record that we have in that one writing. The Sforza, of course, very interesting. Later on, this is the great story. This is the dog ate my homework story. And what happened here is that the widow commissions this book and commissions these beautiful paintings. Unfortunately, on the way to the delivery, half the paintings were stolen and were never delivered, and the rest of the book had to be finished off. And this is the last painting of the Death of the Virgin. It's utterly beautiful. In my opinion, this is one of the most beautiful pieces of art. Not only does it show that, both the people doing the reading are wearing nasal specs at this period, which we know are common in Milan, because he's ordering them by the dozen. This is the myopia story. This is the first real evidence we have of myopia. This character was probably one of the last non-priests ever to be elected to be a pope. And you see him holding his little spyglass down here. And if we look at that in detail, it's a minus lens. And here it is. And here it is again. Traditionally, we think that this lens was owned by Leo, and it's certainly a minus lens. And he used to use it to go out hunting, and said his eyesight was better than anyone else's. But once he became pope, he thought it would not be the right thing to do to be seen with glasses. So he didn't use them at all, and this caused some amusement. He said, His Holiness is in good health and does not wear spectacles because he sees with the assistance of the Cardinal of Aragon and divine providence. Now, more pictures. There's dozens of pictures in the record. Here he is holding his glasses on because he's reading down and they would fall off. Again, it took Scarlett in London to fix this problem. And a beautiful image, just half of them shown here. That's probably Crivelli's image, is probably one of the best depictions of this period. He had an interesting life as well, having to flee his hometown after a bit of ne'er-do-well between the sheets and ended up living somewhere else, and it's difficult to trace. Glasses again in this painting, which is in Washington, of St. Anthony. We've mentioned St. Anthony before because of the pigs in St. Anthony's Hospital, but a nice clear depiction of him. He's not holding them. These are now fitting quite tightly onto his nose. And we mentioned this character before with a larger picture showing you his spectacles. Very proud of his spectacles, implying his piety and his ability of reading the Bible. We saw those dark glasses, and they've always intrigued me because there are many images of people wearing dark glasses, and they're usually in a musical context, either in Lundberg, where they come from the choir, or here, where Ockeghem is actually wearing them. And it seems to be a fad with musicians, doesn't it, to wear dark glasses, implausibly dark. This character invented a particular way of performing music with the modes that is really very, very interesting and extremely complicated. Glasses, we mentioned, moved out of church. They became cheap. Here we are. The doctor's wearing them, the surgeon. Pretty much the lowest of the low in those days. Still is, in some people's opinion. We have printed images now. This is the first printed image of spectacles. Now, two things happen here. Now you start printing books, you've got more books, you're going to need more glasses. And you get more images of people wearing them. And it becomes quite respectable to wear glasses. This was formerly thought to be the oldest image of spectacles. We now know it's the second one. It's actually labelled as Rhazes. It's not Rhazes, it's just a generic philosopher, and it's labelled in this particular one Rhazes. I'm quite sure a book will turn up in the future, if it hasn't already done, with another philosopher, perhaps Hippocrates, on it. This is someone, there are so many books to read. He needs outside glasses, and he's got to flick through them with a feather duster to get through them on time. And this satire of using large glasses, of course, still exists. And even on the TV today, if we want to satirise someone, as you saw in my first image, we make large glasses. Because they're funny, people wearing glasses. The Brillenmacher, this is spectacles being made, and the special way they were ground to actually make them up. And it was quite a hard mechanism of grinding these. It was tough work. Some changes happen about the 17th century where we get better frames, a little bit of a spring. This is technically very difficult to do without breaking the single piece, and some examples exist where there's even 4 springs within it. And in Nuremberg, you have these master spectacle frame makers. These aren't due for sale. These are your setting out. This was my apprenticeship piece. And several exist. They also were made in Regensburg, but no samples occur. As well as those expensive spectacles, Nuremberg made these very cheap ones with this one piece of wire clipped around. And these lasted for hundreds of years. And I've actually found quite a late example for sale on the internet in its original box. So for hundreds of years, these types of spectacles were used as a pince-nez to pinch onto the nose. Many images showing spectacles being used at this period, so clearly they were quite common. Even Samuel Pepys, and he had a coloured pair, perhaps similar to these. He thought that his eyes were going bad because he was doing too much work by candlelight. There may be other explanations if you actually read his diary, but nevertheless, here's one quote that may show it. He said, "I did entertain myself with my perspective glass up and down the church, by which I had the great pleasure of seeing and gazing on a great many fine women. And what with that and sleeping, I passed away the time till the sermon was done." Even children's books start showing spectacles and mirrors being illustrated, and beautiful images of spectacles coming up. He was related to Rembrandt and didn't do many paintings, but the paintings he did were amazing. Self-portraits of spectacles coming up. Here's his self-portrait, balanced on the end of the nose. And the Spectacle Makers Guild appears in London about this time, about 100 years after it appeared in Germany. They had a function to make sure the quality of spectacles was good, and if it wasn't, they took it to the London Stone, where they smashed the glasses and the frame. So there was a quality issue. It wasn't just a conspiracy against the laity. And one famous John Marshall, who has spoken here, as you may remember, and may speak next year on lasers, became a freeman of the Turners Company, optician to George I. He invented a new way of grinding lenses of high quality en masse, and this was recommended by the Gresham Professor Hooke and subsequently by the Royal Society. And then they said, as by the Royal Society. So London spectacle making comes on and becomes famous. In Spain, Quevedo is an example of someone wearing leather-framed myopic glasses. He was a famous poet of the period, but since he always wore these because he was short-sighted and was in the public light due to his parents, he actually had a number of deformities. He had a clubfoot and a hunchback, and he was very unfortunate and very myopic. The word pince-nez in Spanish is actually a Quevedos, which is his name. Many stories of buying a dozen or a gross or several gross of spectacles in the Oliver Goldsmith's only novel. The son is sent out because the family are in poor times. He sells the horse and comes back with a bunch of these, which are actually worth nothing almost. German metal specs were a penny each wholesale, and he's sold the horse, thinking there might have been English spectacles which were more expensive because they were of a better quality at that time. Different types of eyeglasses. There's hundreds of prints of these. And here we first recognise the first glasses, the world's oldest pair of spectacles in the British Optical Association Museum in Craven Street, and thanks very much to Neil Handley, who is actually sitting with us tonight. There's some interesting things about this spectacle that Neil and I have discussed. It may be that this is a later edition because you'll see that the frame has been constricted down. A more representative type, and interestingly in its original case, is here. They were designed to fit on the side of your wig, so they wouldn't fall off. So you didn't have all that nonsense of them falling down when you read. And then the next invention was to actually make them a bit longer, so they could go around even a larger wig and not fall off. And you could get them, of course, in fashionable colours, again with its original case. Turner had a pair of these extra extending folding ones, and there was another design that was called the pin turn. And this was actually quite popular, and I've actually seen modern, by modern 1930s, there were some bespoke. Chardin was pictured with his side new spectacles that are not going to fall off his nose. Notice nose bridges haven't quite just come in yet, and some people used to make them themselves. Now, back in Spain, we're going retro. Look at this. This pair of glasses would not have actually disgraced those pictures of the ancient Italian monks. He's not going into side pieces. This is solid gold, solid Spanish engineering. And forget those English newfangled side pieces. We're going to just have them in the hand. Very interesting, beautiful painting in Chicago. Peter Dolland of Dolland & Aitchison, very, very old company in England until about 2 months ago, and it's now called Boots Opticians, which is a great shame because Dolland goes back a long way, unfortunately incorrectly spelt at that stage. Now, Benjamin Franklin, of course, is credited with wearing bifocals, but we don't have any pictures of him wearing bifocals contemporaneous with the period when he said that he invented them. What you did was you shoved them up on the top of your head when you didn't want them, and you stuck them up, or in my case, you stick them around your neck. And we have many examples of this, including the American president in the early 1800s. But if he did invent bifocals, and he probably has a good claim as the person who invented them, then they were certainly made by English optometrists, perhaps in Paris, perhaps in London. Here's the very famous picture of him, which was subsequently copied by Charles Wilson Peale, the American artist, which was commissioned because he's reading the papers. He's not wearing bifocals. And he would have been shown as wearing bifocals if he was so proud of them at this stage. So there's a little bit of a story that isn't quite fully worked out with Benjamin Franklin. Certainly he's been credited with them, as mentioned, and certainly writes about them. But the opticians locally were quite prepared and knew how to make them when he asked for them. They were familiar with making bespoke spectacles. Martin's margins came in because, of course, as we now know, too much light in the eyes is bad for you. And so they restricted the light in the eyes by putting these margins in. Interestingly, notice the asymmetry between the dominant right eye, which has more shielded, as was similar in those previous spectacles we showed you earlier, perhaps the one he put his telescope onto. Here's Michael Manelli demonstrating the latest fashion of Dr. Richardson glasses, which were the 4 lenses together. This could have several functions. Perhaps you could use this as an extra plus lens, and you could make your distance glasses reading as well by flicking them in. But more commonly, they were used to protect you when you were travelling on these open railway carriages between Liverpool and Manchester. They're now coming back into fashion because those who live in sunny countries get a condition called pterygium, which occurs from sunlight coming in from the side. And it's blinding if it's not treated, and this is how we treat it. We take it off, and it's a fairly bloody and interesting operation, and then we sew on a tiny bit of fresh conjunctiva, which I've harvested from below. You can tell by the pigmentation of the lids that these are people who've grown up in hot countries. Wollaston invents some changes to get rid of aberrations and astigmatism, where things focus in 2 different planes, but essentially causing one hell of a blur, was fixed up by this guy, Airy, who was here a character wearing his oval spectacles, which were to correct in 2 different planes, 2 different powers of a different strength in different meridians. And then by the 19th century, lots of different styles of glasses are shown here. And we'll discuss some of them. The Scissor Spectacles. These are a very ornate pair, French. This is an English pair in its original case. Washington had a really bad time at the end of the war because none of the soldiers had been paid and they were about to mutiny and threatening to march on Congress. So he was sent, this really is the job from hell, to go and talk to them and try and placate them. And he did speak to them, and they were not happy, and he could have been lynched himself. So he sighed, and he pulled out a letter, and there was a pause. And then he sighed again, and he pulled out his reading glasses. He then read them the letter, and he said, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I've not only grown grey, but almost blind in the service of this country." So they let him off, and they decided to wait for their pay. So these glasses saved America, according to the Americans. But perhaps not if you're a Red Indian. Who knows? Theodore Roosevelt, of course, who was also good at shooting wild animals, is wearing his spectacles here. But most importantly, they were used in war. This is Kurt Wintgens, who was the first person to shoot down an enemy aircraft with a machine gun firing directly through the propellers. And here it is, and that's his Fokker there. And a 1915 photograph of it, and here's not his, but another one, showing the machine gun mounted. And then he went on to become an ace, but unfortunately, as with most aces, his day came and he was actually shot down himself. But there he is, wearing his pince-nez. Now, in the next war, of course, you weren't allowed to wear glasses if you were in German uniform, so contact lenses became the way forward. There were quite bizarre early contact lenses. These were actually invented for diving underwater and correcting sight there. They've got a long history of the theory of contact lenses, which I won't bore you with too much tonight, except to say people were thinking about them, but you had to actually invent them. And imagine putting something glass on your eyes. Well, if you've got a bad eye disease that's like having acid in your eyes all the time, then you will put it on. Now, this was the first guy to actually do this, and he put them onto a sick eye, and it worked. And then he said, he called it glass cornea, and he said, maybe we could use this for seeing out of. But unfortunately, it didn't catch on and was unable to work, and very few patients actually got vision out of these uncomfortable lenses. Part of the reason was you've got to get the shape right. So then you've worked out how to mould the shape. So you've got a different shape for the cornea and for the sclera, and these are these beautiful lenses, and you can add things to the glass to make it look realistic. And here's an example of a Second World War stripped from a German officer when he was captured, and many of these ended up in America and England as spoils of war, as you can see here. Beautiful materials. These were expensive pieces of kit, and then soft lenses were invented, and they were so easy to wear and so beautiful that people actually used them to change the colour of their eyes. This brown eye is being turned blue, and it looks very effective from a distance, not highly magnified, of course, like this. But the problem with them being easy to wear, easy to fit, is people got them off the internet. And this is where you may look away now of a nervous disposition, as we found in Croydon that we were actually having an awful lot of contact lens infections. Some of them, like this, are pseudomonas, and they're blinding. When this is finished, you won't see out of this eye, and you'll need to have surgery with a corneal transplant to correct it. Similarly here. Similarly here, and you'll be lucky if you can save the eye in some of these instances. And then there are weird little bugs that occur in swimming pools and water, and in tap water in England because of the French, and that's another story I'll tell you about another day. But because of Napoleon, we have these things called acanthamoeba that are present throughout our drinking water. Luckily, most infections are of these mild type, as we showed on this study, only a few are of the severe type, and contact lenses are incredibly safe if they're done properly. However, don't sleep in them, don't wear them, don't swim in them, and don't be a boy and smoke and party in them. Use them properly under supervision, and you'll have safe and long-term wear. So, much has been written, ranging from the valuable to the worthless, about the invention of eyeglasses, but when it's all summed up, the fact remains the world has found lenses on its nose without knowing whom to thank, says Vasco Ronchi in 1946. And this is the subject of our next lecture next year, showing how laser surgery can carve the contact lens onto your own eye so you don't have to wear a prosthesis. Thank you.